And another part of the question here was, what differentiates the way they use the effects of these musicians? What sets them apart in this usage? For example, you just mentioned Keith Richards with the FUZZ thing, that he played Satisfaction and it became world-renowned, an anthem.
Yeah, practically every rock band had a fuzz, right, man?
Exactly. They were obliged to have fuzz. But the fuzz had already emerged before him. We were discussing this off camera, even if you want to talk about this issue of the fuzz, right? The emergence of the fuzz. I think it's cool, even to illustrate for the people who will be watching. But what was different, for example, in Keith Richards' use that made every band want to have a fuzz, be obliged to use a fuzz when playing? What do you see as different, for example, in the way he used the effect that didn't happen before, right? When the effect became popular, that sound became popular, but it didn't work out that well. Yeah, actually, I think it was very much a matter of context, of the time, for example.
Yeah, because at that time, the English bands had already reached the mainstream, right? So the appeal was already very strong, right? Before they recorded Satisfaction. And the fuzz, when it first appeared, it emerged as a defect, right? Because you got fuzz in amplifiers that were malfunctioning.
Sometimes with the speaker cone already quite damaged.
Yeah, like the recording of Ike Turner's band, Rocket 88, if I'm not mistaken. Well, I should check that in the book later. But it happened. Like this. They were taking the equipment to the studio. The amplifier fell, damaged the cone, and when they got there, they had to record with the amp.
There was no other option but to record, right?
It resulted in a fuzz sound. This was in 1951, and then later, in the 60s, you see another recording that is emblematic of fuzz, but it's from country music. And then a damaged amp wasn't used. Instead, a fuzz box was used, but it wasn't a fuzz pedal yet. It was a circuit mounted in a box. A guy from a radio station built it, passed it to a producer. The producer then used it in the artist's guitar recording. But the first actual fuzz pedal was built after the recording of a song. Also, a country music song that reached #1 on the Billboard, which is Don't Worry by Marty Robbins, right? And there it was used on a bass. So, I mean, we often associate rock with fans, right? And guitar, then suddenly country music, bass.
Country music, bass, and fans. What's going on?
Exactly. So the story is a bit different. But then, if you look at it, there are curious things there. Because it was a bass played by a guitarist, and it wasn't the bass leading the music, no. It was kind of like a baritone guitar there, right? It's a 6-string bass, officially. It's a bass. Yes. They were the first 6-string models, right? In this case, one that Dan Electro had launched, which nowadays we could consider as a precursor to baritone guitars, because it is actually a guitar tuned 1 tone lower. So you can play chords, guitar harmony, you can do it on the bass easily. Cool. The scale patterns, everything. And then he recorded the solo, and it ended up staying.
In the recording, the producer liked it. And you mentioned that, right, we were talking off the record. You mentioned that the musician, right, he wasn't hearing that fuzz sound, right? Yeah, because the reference he was having was from the amplifier that was there with him and everything was here.
Exactly. Then he went to listen to the recording, and it had that fuzz sound. And then it's like, should it stay or not stay or not? It ended up staying in the song, and the song reached #1. And then several musicians from the country scene started going to the studio, asking for that sound. They also wanted to record with that sound.
It became a craze, right?
Exactly. But when they got there, that sound wasn't there. The console had been fixed because it was a transformer problem. The console was repaired, and then that sound was gone. But the sound engineer had the idea to create a circuit, transistorized. He and his partner there, Glenn Snods, who is a sound engineer, and the technician, Ravis Hobbs. And then they took the project to Gibson. Gibson decided to launch it, but first released it as a built-in circuit in bass guitars.
The bass guitars already came with this circuit to generate this effect built into them.
Exactly. But then there's another thing you might say, okay, so it was released as a built-in circuit in the bass because it was recorded with a bass, but the basses that had the built-in circuit were not of the style of the one that was recorded. Exactly. What kind of confusion is this? Then it was released in pedal format by Maestro, and that thing, right, as you even mentioned, it got stuck. It was stuck for years, right?
It flopped big time, right? Nowadays we say it flopped like it was released. Everyone wanted that sound at the time. Gibson released it, right, the Maestro for Stone, and no one bought it.
Yeah, because it was released in 62 and it only started selling in 65. Yeah, a long time, right? When the Stones released Satisfaction.
That's when the fuzz boom happened, right?
So Satisfaction was the big culprit. And the fan became, along with the air, one of the great effects of psychedelic rock.
Mid-60s and 70s. That was mid-60s to 70s. In Hendrix's hands, it was also a game, right? What he did with the Warface and the Marshall.
Exactly. Now, speaking of Hendrix, you also have many times we don't remember the studio effects that were used by Hendrix in recording. There was a lot that wasn't part of Hendrix's setup. There was a lot that Ed Kramer, who was his trusted studio sound engineer, added, right? There was tape delay, plate reverb. The second Hendrix album has an absurd amount of panning. The guitar is constantly on the right and left sides.
That's true. These albums are very interesting to listen to with headphones. It's a different experience, right? Because it's different than if you play it on a Bluetooth speaker. Sure, you're enjoying some cool music. But these albums, like Hendrix, Led Zeppelin, those older ones, right, from Deep Purple. Beatles, I think.
Depending on the mono or stereo version, it's already very different.
I think it's really cool to listen to this material with a good pair of headphones because, man, you'll notice all the nuances of why we say that these guys were geniuses in their time. Things that we consider normal today are normal because these people paved the way before. They were the ones who did all the experimentation, took the risks, and if it turned out bad, wow, releasing a song nowadays is relatively much simpler than it was in the 60s and 70s, right? Nowadays, you can record at home, upload this content to Spotify, share the link on Instagram, and it's all good. Back then, you didn't have that. It was completely different. So, we say that these people are brilliant for the effects, for the recording part, because they paved the way for everything we know today about music, recording, studio work, the use of effects, and everything else, right?
And in many aspects, they are still ahead, right? One thing, for example, that people often don't remember, and that marked the era significantly because the Beatles are enormous, right? The most influential band of all time, there's no denying that.
People may like them or not, but there's no denying it.
Yeah, exactly. It was about the Beatles going to the studios, stopping touring and going to the studios, and the revolution they made there was enormous. Because you see, the thing about just a matter of ADT, which were the effects, it was the effects system they used in the recording. Even today, we don't have exactly the same. Well, as far as I know, there's no way to bring it to pedals exactly. Even though you have a Strymon Deco that simulates tape things, but the resources there go beyond. The ADT goes beyond. You can modulate. For example, a delay time to create a chorus effect, not just by varying the delay, but by advancing it. You simply can't do that with a pedal.
That's true. For those who don't know what an ADT is, explain it to them so they don't get lost.
The ADT is a double tracking recording system that was developed because John Lennon was fed up with doing vocal doubles with the Beatles, spending hours and hours there, and he pestered the guy at Bay Road, which was called EMI Studios at the time, Ken Townsend, to find a way to do it faster.
These vocal doubles?
The vocal doubles. So Ken Townsend went home thinking and came back with this idea to make use of the resources available at EMI Studios, because back then it wasn't like today where you set up a studio by buying equipment from various places. At that time, studios built their own equipment. So the tape system that EMI had wasn't available in other studios. That's why the sound effects you hear with the Beatles can't be found in other sounds, in other bands of that time.
Another band at the time could only achieve that sound if they recorded at Abbey Road.
Exactly. And if it was allowed for them.
There's that too.
So, you see, the Beatles didn't use many effects. Of course they did. But the effects they used were produced by a tape system, which was the ADT, that mixed two reel-to-reel recorders, and the sound was mixed on a third one, and there you could generate effects that later only started to be used in stage setups, for example, by musicians with the BBD technology that emerged in 1975 and began to be applied in pedals. It started to be applied in pedals weekly. So, I mean, those guys were really ahead of their time. They started to use ADT in the studio in '66.
Wow, practically 10 years earlier.
Yeah, so they were able to create tape choruses, tape flanges, various effects, and still in a way that sounded different. Not just because it was tape, but because they had different resources to tweak, even back then.
Wow. Well, in other words, people were literally ahead of their time there, right? Way ahead. It's that thing I mentioned. It's the people who laid the groundwork for everything we have today in recording.
Exactly.